Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochak, and I'm a Thomas Jefferson scholar, historian, and philosopher. And today I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson and free presses. The question I ask is, did Jefferson have a consistent message concerning free presses? Perhaps not unlike other prominent politicians of his time, Thomas Jefferson had an ambivalent relationship with the press. That ambivalence expressed itself in an unflagging theoretical commitment to free presses with growing practical recognition as he advanced in years that free presses seldom concern themselves with truth. Thus, while he recognized that public papers were often put to use for political posture in spite of the strictures of the First Amendment, he also recognized that a Jeffersonian Republican government consistent with Jefferson's political philosophy needed free presses. Without free presses, there could not be an informed citizenry, and without an informed citizenry, the likelihood of abusive governors and corrupt government would decuple. So presses in a Jeffersonian republic had to be free. That sentiment is duly noted in the secondary literature on Jefferson and presses. Yet Jefferson also came to recognize that the gazettes of nations with a commitment to free presses were vehicles of inculpation, not only the politics-sanctioned censors of government, but also politics-sanctioned sycophants of government. Thus, there is the intimation that the potential for public harm through political bias and libel far exceeds their potential for public good through dissemination of useful, fact-based information. That is generally overlooked in the secondary literature. So too is the tension between Jefferson's experiences with presses and his theoretical commitment to their indispensability in a Jefferson republic. Now, Jefferson's theoretical commitment to free presses is evident in several letters, none better than an 1816 letter to Charles Yancey, written early in 1816. He writes, "If a nation expects to be free and ignorant, in a state of civilization, it expects what was and never will be. The functionaries of every government have propensities to command at will the liberty and property of their constituents. There is no safe deposit for these but with the people themselves, nor can they be safe with them without information. Where the press is free and every man is able to read, all is safe." In 1787, he writes to Virginia patriot Edward Carrington, and he praises the good sense of the people as the best army against political abuse. Though they are sometimes led astray, and he has certain shades of rebellion in mind here, they soon correct themselves. We keep people from erring by giving them full information on their affairs through the channels of the public papers. He sums in a famous quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them." In a letter to President Washington in 1792, Jefferson says that free presses are the vehicles of the censors and sycophants of government. Still, he writes, "Nature has given to each man no other means of sifting out the truth, either in religion, law, or politics." And finally, in a 1823 letter to Lafayette, Jefferson says, "An hereditary chief strictly limited will go far towards keeping the government honest and unoppressed. But the only security of all is in a free press. The force of public opinion cannot be resisted when permitted freely to be expressed. The agitation it produces must be submitted to. It is necessary to keep the waters pure." Now that sentiment you might recognize is similar to a sentiment. That sentiment of agitation is similar to a sentiment he expresses in an early 1787 letter to James Madison, in which he refers to certain the turbulence of Republican government, and he's referring to pockets of rebellion that spring up periodically. Yet that turbulence, thinks Jefferson, is, and I quote, "as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical." In other words, it is, again I quote, "a medicine necessary for the sound health of government." For Jefferson, ignorance and freedom are inconsistent. If a nation is to be free, then it must have free presses and a citizenry in which all people are able to read the printed papers. The argument for free presses and for a citizenry capable of reading them is theoretical, insofar as Jefferson is not arguing as an above-board empiricist from effects to causes. In other words, he is not appealing to data which show that free presses are correlated with free and happy citizens and thus very probably causally linked. But instead, he's arguing from the safe perch of deductive reasoning in which a conclusion only spits back information contained in the premises. Jefferson begins with the notion of an ideal Republican government and then works back to the things indispensable for its actualization, or what is more likely for its approximation. Yet, Jefferson's own experiences with free presses, expressed in numerous letters and from his tenure as Secretary of State till his death, seem not to conform to his theoretical commitments. Now here I can only offer a handful of samples that are representative of his castigation of the presses. To South Carolina politician Edward Rutledge in 1796, Jefferson says there is so much of eulogy and of abuse in the prominent papers of the nation. The harm of abuse, he adds, greatly exceeds the capacity of puffery to heal. To Samuel Smith in 1798, Jefferson states that response to the calumnies of newspapers is a sort of Hydra's head. He writes, "Were I to undertake to answer the calumnies of the newspaper, it would be more than all my own time, and that of 20 aides could effect. For while I should be answering one, 20 new ones would be invented." He writes to Mark August Pictet in 1803 that public judgment is the best verdict concerning the line of separation between the abuse of the wholesome use of the press and its unwholesome use. To James Madison in 1809, Jefferson says that a word of truth in the papers now and then comes like the drop of water on the tongue of Dives. To John B. Colvin in 1809, Jefferson admits to indifferency on the scurrilities of the newspapers. To John Adams in 1812, he says, "I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much the happier." To James Monroe in 1815, he writes, "The truth now and then projected into the ocean of newspaper lies serves like headlands to correct our course." Finally, to Nathaniel Macon in 1819, Jefferson writes, "I read no newspapers now but Ritchie's, and in that chiefly the advertisements, for they contain the only truths to be relied on in a newspaper." Now, Jefferson's experiences with free presses seem to be inconsistent with his theoretical commitment to free presses. Those writings on newspapers focus on the great potential harm caused by their politics-based sycophancy and calumny, not on the benefits of dissemination of useful information. Too few truths are published, and it is a Bunyan-esque task to sift out those truths from the ocean of newspaper lies. So numerous are the lies that the few truths are customarily taken as lies. Moreover, even if sifted out, those truths are often of such a general sort to be of very little use. In 1807, Jefferson writes a letter to newspaper editor John Norval in response to Norval asking, "How can a paper be made most useful?" Jefferson responds tersely, "It needs to restrain itself to," and I quote, "true facts and sound principles only." Yet he replies, "Such a paper would find few subscribers." Even truth hides in newspapers because readers are so accustomed to untruths that truth is taken as falsehood. Jefferson then offers a prescription for reform. Again, I quote, "Perhaps an editor might begin a reformation in some such way as this: divide his paper into 4 chapters, heading the first truths, second probabilities, third possibilities, fourth lies. Each successive section would be proportionately larger than the one preceding it, and be read with greater and would be read with greater relish. In 1803, he considers selected prosecution of libelous slander. He writes to Thomas McKean in February. A few prosecutions of the most prominent offenders would have a wholesome effect in restoring the integrity of the presses. Not a general prosecution, for that would look like persecution, but a selected one. Now, those selected prosecutions are to come through the individual states, not the federal government, with which it has more serious matters to contend. Jefferson's sentiment, John Bowles thinks in his recent biography, is an inconsistency. He writes, the letter to McKean contracted a basic principle of Jefferson's faith in free presses, contradicted a basic principle in Jefferson's faith in free presses, elsewhere stated in innumerable letters. It is thus, says Bowles, a blemish on Jefferson's reputation, and we are to hold him accountable for that blemish. Now, Bowles' censure of Jefferson, I think, is hare-footed for several reasons. First, Bowles takes no notice of the many letters expressive of Jefferson's lack of faith in free presses, and that, to me, that omission is astonishing. Next, Jefferson is clear that the power to prosecute papers for libel already exists. It need not to be instantiated, and it exists, as he tells McKean, in the laws of the several states. And that is a point he iterates in a letter to Abigail Adams, that the several states have the power to prosecute if they have the interest, the money, and the time. He writes, it is for the states to decide whether they have the desired time and money to prosecute libel. Furthermore, even if we take the letter to McKean as a glitch in Jefferson's thinking on free presses, is it really a blemish on a man's reputation to wish to see incentives for newspapers to concern themselves with veridicality and not lies? I don't think so. Finally, the letter to McKean is singular and unreflective of Jefferson's general stance on the issue. Jefferson overall disliked the notion of selective prosecution of libelous slander. Why? As he said in his letter to Seymour, he thought that a government conducting itself with probity and transparency had nothing to fear from slander. That notion is not singular. He expresses it in numerous other letters, Levi linking to William Short and Messieurs Vivial and Jourdain. So Jefferson's overall attitude, we may conclude, is one of disrelish of selective prosecutions. The letter to McKean, in which he mentions selective prosecutions, is singular, and as Dumas Malone notes in his book on Jefferson's first term as president, too much emphasis ought not to be placed on it. In sum, Jefferson's overall inclination concerning presses, in spite of the letter to McKean, was not to prosecute libel, if only to prove as a sort of litmus test for sound Republican governing. Libel in the eyes of the citizenry would be most innocuous so long as an administration conducted itself with integrity and with transparency. Given that, libel having substantial effect would be a sort of signal that the severe criticisms were not libelous assertions, but accurate claims concerning degenerative government. Now, Jefferson's letters to Seymour, linking in Short, in those letters, he refers to free presses in a Republican government as an experiment. That experiment concerns the possibility of the compatibility of free presses with orderly government. And that, I think, seems odd. It seems at odds with the sentiment expressed in letters to Carrington, Washington, Yancey, and Lafayette, namely the indispensability of free presses for Republican government. Yet Jefferson's theoretical commitment to free presses in the Jeffersonian Republic, namely government of and by the people through elected representatives, demands a certain amount of education in the general citizenry, and that demands a suitable vehicle of dissemination of information, that is free presses, is also an experiment, and perhaps an odd one. The oddness, I think, disappears once one recognizes that Jefferson, like others of his day, often refers to Republican government as an experiment, even a great experiment. The value of Republican government has yet to be proven over time. Its promise rests largely on the failure of this aristocratic, whether of one of few, forms of governing over the centuries. And I mean abusive aristocratic governments. Yet free presses for Jefferson were also an experiment within the theoretical frame of Republican governing, qua experiments. And so perhaps we need further discussion of that. As Jefferson matured, he came to see a free press as part of the turbulence to which it, Republican government in other words, is subject, that he mentions, of course, in his 1787 letter to James Madison. Still, Jefferson adds, even this evil is productive of good. It prevents the degeneracy of government and nourishes a general attention to the public affairs. Thus, failure of free presses would be a signal that the turbulence of a Jefferson Republic is too great for it to be a viable alternative to the varied and oppressive aristocracies that prevailed in the centuries prior to the American Revolution. Jefferson ultimately noted in his second inaugural address that the experiment has been tried and is a success, as the citizenry in the election had spoken overwhelmingly on behalf of Jeffersonian republicanism by electing him to a second term. Now, Jefferson's faith in free presses, in spite of their large tendency for fantastication, was ultimately faith in the people, each of whom possessed moral sensibility sufficient to be a check on abusive government. That comes out in his 1787 letter to Peter Carr, in which Jefferson states that a plowman will grasp a moral situation better than a professor. It also comes out in numerous utterances that juries are much less liable to err than judges. Now, that faith in the people is directly expressed in his letters to Yancey, Washington, and Lafayette, and it is why, with the exception of his letter to Norval, in which he states, "It is not he who prints, but he who pays for printing a slander who is its real author," he consistently inculpates editors for the scurrilities and exculpates the public, which ingests and digests those scurrilities. In other words, the public is never to blame. It's always the editors who are to blame. Okay. Were he alive today, and were he to see the partisan bickering that is the essence of the political media, and were he to see the public love of that double Dutch, Jefferson would likely rethink public exculpation. He might also come to recognize, as did Freud, that people are as demonic as they are saintly. Thank you.